Thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second part of today's two panels of a staff-led load forecasting panel that is convened by Federal Energy Regulatory Commission staff in docket number 8010-12-17. My name is Chris Young. I'm a division director in the Office of Technical Reporting and Economics. I'm joined by my co-moderator, Paige Bradford from OTRE, several other OTRE staff, and by Maria Hanley and Ray Orocco-John from the Office of Electric Reliability. Thanks everybody for being here. This panel is going to provide a public opportunity to discuss issues, practices, and challenges associated with the critical function of load forecasting. In recent years, load forecasting has become increasingly complex. Planners and operators are addressing rapid load growth, increasing electrification across sectors, changing customer demand patterns, and the emergence of large new loads. Load forecasts serve a critical input into numerous planning and operational decisions, including resource adequacy assessments, transmission planning, and the reliable operation of the bulk power system. Our panel today will focus on the challenges and opportunities associated with improving load forecasting practices. Specifically, this panel is going to explore how load forecasts are made, including how large loads are integrated into those processes, and how forecasts are used in planning and operational decisions. Thanks to all of the panelists for joining us this afternoon. We're looking forward to a robust conversation. First, I do want to remind everybody that we do not intend to discuss any specific proceedings that are pending before the Commission. If a topic comes up that we do need to avoid, staff will unmute and redirect the conversation. And last, before I get started, I'm going to ask my co-moderator, Paige Bradford, to introduce herself and her panels. Before that, I also want to note that, like this morning, we're going to take a 15-minute break around 3:15, depending upon how the conversation goes. Paige.
Hello?
These.
Oh. I mean, I can speak loudly. I think everyone's muted. Hello?
It's the global mute.
Okay, well, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Paige Bradford. I am an energy industry analyst in the Office of Technical Reporting and Economics, and I will be your co-moderator today. So before we dive into questions, I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists. Moving from right to left, first we have D.L. Oates. He is the Executive Director of Market and Grid Research for Midcontinent ISO, where his team supports the continued development of MISO's markets, operations, and planning functions. Mr. Oates also provides executive oversight over MISO's initiative to reliably integrate and serve large loads. Next, we have Greg Poulos. He serves as the Executive Director of Consumer Advocates of the PJM states, a role he has had since 2017. Mr. Poulos has also worked in demand response industry for the Office of the Ohio Consumers Council and for the Ohio Attorney General's Office. Looks like my mic is back on. Next, we have John Moura, the Director of Reliability Assessment and Performance Analysis for the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, where among other important roles, Mr. Moura oversees the development of NERC's annual long-term and seasonal reliability assessments. Next, we have John Wilson. He is a Vice President at Grid Strategies. He has had a long and successful career in the power industry, and among other things was the project team lead of the Energy Systems Integration Group report titled Forecasting for Large Loads, Current Practices and Recommendations. Next, Kent Chandler is a non-resident senior fellow at the R Street Institute and previously served on the Kentucky Public Service Commission, including 3 years as its chairman. Next, we have Mudita Suri. She leads the energy and watergy strategy for Amazon Web Services across the U.S. West and Latin America. and transmission strategy for all of AWS Americas. Ms. Surrey holds a master's in electrical engineering and also has worked for the wind OEM and at MISO and CAISO in transmission planning and control room market operations. Thank you all for joining us as panelists. We're really excited for the conversation today. Just some process notes before we begin. If you'd like to answer a question or make a comment to someone else's response, please put your name tent on its side. And to unmute your mic, press the button next to the microphone. If the green light is on, that means your mic is on. If you are not responding to a question or a comment, please keep your microphone muted.
Yeah, thanks for bearing with our microphone issues. I hope all of you guys have microphones that work for everybody online and in the room to hear us. I wanted to kick off the conversation with sort of a softball to level set and just go down the line from, I guess, my right to my left, and note that everyone on this panel either has a role in preparing load forecasts or relies on accurate load forecasts for work and functions that you do and perform. And I think it would be interesting to hear from your perspective in the regions where you work, what are the principal elements of load forecasting processes that we should focus on today? And anything else you'd like to add to kick off the conversation? Thanks. So DL.
All right, and just to make sure, is this where I can do a little bit of self-introduction?
Help yourself.
Okay. Thanks for that. Again, my name is D.L. Oates, and I'm the Executive Director of Markets and Grid Research at MISO. As you know, MISO serves over 45 million customers across 15 states from Montana to Michigan and Minnesota to Mississippi. MISO is responsible for the reliable and efficient operation of the bulk electric system in our footprint and for playing a role in transmission planning and resource adequacy, responsibilities which we carry out in accordance with our tariff and in partnership with our states, our members, and our stakeholders. That collaboration is key in all areas, but particularly in the area of resource adequacy, where our states are in the lead and MISO plays a supporting role through our PRA and regional data and outlooks. I'll try to call out some of the ways this impacts load forecasting and how that fits into our processes today. I lead a group at MISO that supports MISO's 4 service lines through research and development, process enhancement, and sometimes strategy support. My group's been involved in some of MISO's recent efforts to refine load forecasting and advance solutions to address large load challenges. And certainly we face some challenges in our region. After more than a decade where load remained flat, and I'll note our peak load in 2025 was about 122 gigawatts, and our peak load in 2013 was about 122 gigawatts. We're now expecting 20 to 30 gigawatts of new large load by 2030. Almost all of that growth, or anticipated growth, comes from large loads, both computational and industrial. MISO has been working with our states, members, and stakeholders to address these challenges in a number of ways. Through queue reform, our joint targeted interconnection queue in partnership with SPP, and our expedited resource addition study process, we've been working to accelerate the throughput of generation interconnection agreements in our footprint. Through enhancements to our expedited project review load study process, we've been able to reduce study times for load interconnection down to around 90 days. And through our newly formed large load working group, we've been working with our stakeholders on a variety of additional solutions to support fast, efficient, and reliable service for large loads, including solutions.
If I may interrupt?
Yeah.
Because of the pending proceedings regarding large load, we appreciate the experience you have, but because some of that may impinge on those proceedings, perhaps we can skip that discussion. We do want to focus on what MISO has done, but maybe focusing on the question might help us avoid any ex parte concerns.
Sure.
Thanks, DL.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I'll just say that load forecasting is related to resource adequacy and transmission planning. And I think these pieces have to come together in a logical way. So moving to forecasting approaches, I think a key point is to try to connect the load forecasts to their use case. And so I'll just lay out a couple of different ways that MISO works with load forecasts through our construct. So on the operating time frame, our forecasts are primarily weather-driven, using time series statistical models. They're highly locational and they feed directly into operational and market systems. MISO has historically taken the lead on developing those forecasts because we're sort of best positioned to do that. We have access to the regional data as well as the systems that they connect to, and we can do a reasonable job of constructing those forecasts. In the prompt year, so moving into the planning timeframe, MISO administers the planning resource auction. That auction is really kind of a final exam for resource adequacy in our footprint, and the load in that auction is not determined by MISO. So in that case, the load forecasts that support the PRA are determined by our members. They're the ones who are primarily responsible for resource adequacy and are best positioned to have visibility into load going into the prompt year. On the true resource planning timeframe, so think 3 to 5 years, again, our members and our states are the ones taking the lead on planning resources. They take a variety of approaches to determining how to construct their load forecasts and how much to invest in terms of generation backed by those forecasts. And here MISO collaborates with our members in the organization of MISO states to compile information about load and resources in the footprint and make it available across our footprint. And that's more of a monthly and seasonal view. On the sort of 10-year transmission planning timeframe, again, we're leaning on our members here, mostly the transmission owners, to provide load forecasts to support our MISO transmission expansion plan and expedited project review processes that help to plan the transmission needed to serve the load. And when it comes to 20-year long-range transmission planning, this is where, again, MISO develops our own scenario-based 20-year load forecast to support long-range transmission planning for a regional backbone. So I'll just quickly hit on a couple of improvements, and then I will stop talking. So on the operating time frame, we have done a bunch of work where you'll hear about some of this tomorrow to improve the accuracy of our short-term load forecasts, including the use of some AI and machine learning tools, which are exciting. And in terms of the long-term load forecast, I'll come back to this a little bit later, but we've spent some time shifting away from pure econometric approaches to more of an end-use modeling approach to try and capture some of the emerging drivers of load forecast of load growth in a scenario-based way. Anyway, I'll leave it there and appreciate the time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Poulos.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to be here today. So I think following on DL talking about some of the resource adequacy, one of the first times I presented on behalf of the consumer advocates of PJM states, CAPS. And I should say that PJM, CAPS is an organization that helps the state-appointed consumer advocates in the PJM region. So there are 13 states plus DC, so 14 jurisdictions. And I help all of them to understand what's going on with PJM and to make their voice heard the best way we can. And one of my first things I did in 2017 was speak at one of these conferences on resource adequacy. And it was quite a challenge at that point to get the advocates to agree on what could be said on their behalf. But one of those things was that they supported wholesale competitive markets. And obviously that support still exists today. But this topic here is one of the things that's come under scrutiny as we've looked at that support. And that's those levers that underlie the support for the wholesale competitive markets. And some of the things I did in my pre-statement was the load forecasting and the reserve margin and things like that that come into play. And your efficiency accreditation of resources. Those are all things that kind of build into the wholesale competitive market. And so this topic here is one that the advocates have been focusing on for quite some time, of the load forecast and its accuracy, because it does play such an important part in how effective and efficient the wholesale competitive market is. And there has been a lot of frustration about the load forecasting in PJM. If you look back in the 2010 to 2018 range, the load forecasting was widely overstated for what over forecasting, and it was a great frustration that those are things that consumers would be paying for. It helps to procure how much resources we need to procure in the region. It did get a lot better. PJM did a really good job and got a lot of support for the efforts they were making, particularly when you got to 2018 and beyond. And then, of course, you got to the data center load, which is a whole new issue. And it really didn't show up until early 2025 was when it really started to recognize it in load forecasts. And even then, the CEO at the time, Mano Estana, at the annual meeting said, we need to address this, and we need to address it quickly. And PJM has done a good job of trying to address it and picking that all up, because before the data center load, the load forecasting was really about going out and talking to the members, the EDCs, the transmission owners, getting their input, and using third-party information, EIA and others, along with the historical data as how they were kind of putting it together. But once you got to data center load, there was a little bit more specific. We need more accurate information. And a lot of credit goes to the states, to FERC, and to outside entities for coming in and saying, we need better information, and we can get it from these data centers. So that was a big part of the change. I still think there, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but more accountability on who is responsible for the load forecast and the impacts, because it does have such impacts on customers. And of course, there has been always almost an emphasis towards a little higher load forecasts, because there is a benefit for the PJM, the region, to make sure there's reliability, and even for the transmission owners who are providing a lot of the information because of the rate base that can be created from the additional planning. So how do we get more accountability on this would be something that we would be looking for and always have been. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. John Moura with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. First, just wanted to extend my appreciation for the invitation to talk at this conference about load forecasts, and it really, my perspective will be how we integrate them into really all the NERC processes. NERC is North American Electric Reliability Corporation. We're the ERO, designated ERO, Electric Reliability Organization in the U.S., the 48 states in the continental U.S., but we also have similar jurisdiction in the 7 Canadian provinces as well. Of course, we are all interconnected, and so standards are critically important when you have an interconnected system. NERC develops standards with the industry, of course, with oversight over FERC. And then we also, the other piece that we do is reliability assessments, so both seasonal and long-term. So these are the two things that are really outlined in the Energy Policy Act that NERC, or the designated ERO, should accomplish: standards and load forecasting. And both of those have key assumptions built into them around the load forecast. Everything that we do in standards and everything we do in assessments really hinges on the load forecast. My specialty is, of course, in assessment, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But of course, our standards are critically important for how transmission gets built, how resources are planned, and again, all with base assumptions about what we expect the loads to be. In almost every engineering study, load forecast is a given. It's a given input, and then you calculate the rest based on that. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things we've seen from the assessment perspective, and I've almost taken it by habit to actually get homework assignments every time I come to FERC. So I thought I'd do some homework assignments before and see if I don't come away with a homework assignment. So I did some analysis. We looked very quickly at the 2015 load forecast. NERC's been doing these assessments for about 60 years, so we have a lot of data about load forecasts. And so, I thought, I might get asked a question, well, how are we doing today on long-term forecasts, right? So it went back to 2015. And what's interesting is that most regions, when you look at, again, 2015, looking at the 10-year forecast, here we are today, most regions and most areas of the country and the continent are within roughly 10% of their realized 2025 demand levels, which suggests, long-term forecasts have been fairly effective. But the challenge today is quite different. Large loads in the data centers, electrification, changing consumer behavior. We're using electricity way different than we ever have. And then really that, meaning the future forecasting success made less dependent on predicting a single outcome and more on characterizing a range of plausible futures. I think that is something that's very common. We hear in this industry, we hear a peak forecast and you have some assumptions about what's included in that forecast. And for decades, we've always been worried about the quantity of load forecast. How much is coming in? Is this new load qualified? Will it be realized? And today is, while there's a quantity issue, our thoughts is it's much more about the quality of those forecasts. What's in them, the details around the ramp rates of those new loads, the different operating characteristics, profiles, different seasonal operating behaviors. All of that has been probably even much more important than the simple large magnitude. So I'll just end some of my initial comments and with, it's a key input into all of our assessments and our standards. And while, having the most accurate load forecast is a good goal, what we want to understand is all the range of plausible outcomes so that we can ensure reliability under each one of those.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Moura. Mr. Wilson.
Hi, thank you. John Wilson with Grid Strategies, and many of you know us as a consulting firm that works on the electric power industry in terms of state regulation, transmission planning, and wholesale markets. My own specialty is more on the state regulatory end of things, and that was why I was selected to be the project leader for the Energy Systems Integration Group's Large Load Task Force. It's a mouthful, load forecast project team. And we assembled a group of people. The whole task force had hundreds of members involved. We had people from the power industry, electric utilities, from MISO, PJM, NERC, regulators, from data centers, consultants like myself. So a real broad cross-section of different kinds of expertise and background are involved in the Large Load Task Force. And our project team focused on load forecasting methods. And what we wanted to know first was what's being done. How are these load forecasts being constructed? And the second thing was, what can we do to improve it? And I think just sort of stepping back to a very big picture, Mr. Poulos, or excuse me, I think Mr. Poulos might have said, 2025 was when PJM really started digging into this. Literally, almost no one in the country was doing sort of a methodological approach to large load forecasting 3 or 4 years ago. So this is a new discipline, and I think there's a lot of concern about load forecasting out there as to whether it's being done well and accurately, and I think a measure of grace needs to be given to the folks who are responsible for this, that literally they have had to develop a whole new set of practices and policies in just the past several years. I think the characterization of econometric load forecasting was correct. During the teens, there was a lot of controversy about that as load forecasters began to work on that. In the late teens and early 20s, we began to see that the forecasts were getting pretty good across many utilities and regions. And, things started to kind of quiet down in a lot of those proceedings, some of which I was involved in at the state regulatory level. And then we had large load forecasting come along and essentially replace that. And, people who were involved in load forecasting were hired there because they were good at managing a straightforward process that would be repeated year after year. And all of a sudden they were being asked to really innovate. And I think it's really to their credit that they have taken that challenge on and accomplished a lot there. Our report that we put together, as I was introduced, Forecasting for Large Loads, Current Practices and Recommendations, looked at the new methods. We did not focus on the econometric long-term forecasts that are there, and we did not focus on the operational activities that Mr. Moura, I think, is more focused on. I would agree with his characterization that is the top priority of the power industry right now, and long-term load forecasting, I think, is a moderately close second. That it's really important, but it's not as important as getting these interconnections and all of those details right, and making sure that we don't have short-term reliability things. So I don't want to, I'm not going to talk about that because that was not within the scope of our report, but I do want to recognize that is a priority of the industry. So we offered 7 recommendations for near-term improvements to address the uncertainties and improve load forecast accuracy. And then we offered 3 recommendations that are longer-term efforts where we think that there's a need for research and institutional development by load forecasting authorities and regulators. And we can get into those in detail during the conversation that comes along today. I would just close by saying I think that the key effort that needs to be made right now is to institutionalize not directives or, this is how we're going to do it, but a more common language and a more transparent set of practices that allow for organizations like MISO, individual utilities like Duke Energy, and other parties to the conversation like data center developers to be speaking the same language. That is one of the things that came up over and over again in our conversations is just simply confusion about what, this model tariff or this model load forecast in this other part of the country was saying. Were we talking about capacity as proposed by the new customer when they were going online? Are we talking about contract capacity? Are we talking about actual peak? The language became very slippery. And I think that's one of the key messages in our report was, here are the areas in which we can get alignment, not uniformity in approach, but alignment in language. And then each organization that's responsible for a different type of load forecast in a different market context can reference others and understand how to improve and grow as the years move forward. And that's really, I think, the key message I would bring to you at the beginning. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I have one request, if I get invited back, is to start down there. If I could sit at the end instead of having to follow folks, that would be much appreciated. I don't know how much there is left for me to say, but I do appreciate the introductions, and it's nice to hear there's going to be a breadth of or significant amount of information from a number of different perspectives. So in addition to previously serving as a state commissioner, I also served on a number of regional entities or sort of national wholesale on the national wholesale front. In addition to participating representing states' interests on the NERC Member Representatives Committee, I also served as a board member and president of the Organization of PJM States and a board member of the Organization of MISO States. For a short time before becoming a commissioner, I was a staffer at the Kentucky Commission, where the first day of my job at the Kentucky Public Service Commission was staffing a commissioner for an OMS board meeting and an OPSI board meeting. So I say all that to say I'm going to focus a lot of my comments on both how retail regulators engage in load forecasts, but also the interaction between retail load forecasts and how they roll into or implicate wholesale market actions that ultimately impact retail consumers. So how retail regulators see load forecasts or deal with load forecasts varies, as you might imagine, across the different jurisdictions. But I want to highlight a couple of ways that it sort of comes across a retail regulator's desk. So the first one would be in a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or a CPCN, CCN, every state calls it something a little different, likely for generation, transmission, or distribution proposals. So this is when a utility is proposing to build something. They'd like prior approval, or they're obligated to seek prior approval from the regulator to get a certificate in order to make that investment. And underpinning that are a number of assumptions, not the least of which is a load forecast. Now, it might be a forecast of expected load on a particular distribution circuit, where the utility is expecting load to exceed the capabilities of that particular substation or that circuit. It might be that the utility is expecting over the next 5 years to have some sort of aggregate demand increase, or it may just be they're hoping to attract large loads to their jurisdiction, and so they're showing up for a new power plant because they want to ensure they have a sufficient margin, or it may be for transmission, right? It may be backbone transmission, or it may be the inclusion in a load forecast of a large load for, and this is transmission to necessarily connect them to the grid. So a CPCN. So the load forecast, as you might imagine with a retail regulator, is not necessarily the very first thing that's checked when somebody walks in and seeks a certificate for a $2 or $3 billion power plant or a multi-$100 million transmission facility. There's considerations around siting. There's cost considerations. Does it actually make sense to build it? And I wouldn't say oftentimes, but it can happen that the sort of idea of, okay, but is this actually needed in the context of the demand being there, occasionally gets missed. Now, it doesn't necessarily get missed for a new generator to meet demand, but it might for transmission upgrades or getting into the details on a distribution system upgrade or a system hardening, new facility for system hardening. It is the load forecast that might underpin the proposal might not end up being the primary thing that the commission is looking at. And I can tell you, I'm speaking from experience, oftentimes it does not get the attention that it necessarily deserves. Another place that load forecasts show up for commissions are integrated resource plans. So similar to CPCNs, many states require utilities to file integrated resource plans on a biennial, triennial, quadrennial basis. The degree to which those individual states review those, the extent of their review, whether there's formal approval or, it's a thank you for telling us about it, and they move on. It varies across all of the states. But like CPCNs, one of the major components of that is a load forecast. And so you have some states that explicitly approve integrated resource plans, review it with amendments. They might just enter an order that says you propose over the next 15 years to build these 3 power plants in these 3 years. We're giving you approval to do so. You have some states that utilities file, and I'm doing air quotes here, I guess I'm recording it. Air quotes here, file or submit to the commission an IRP for the commission's sort of like awareness, but there's no formal review process. And then you have some vertically integrated states where the utilities are obligated to do their own planning, but there's not something called an IRP. It's not necessarily required for approval, but the load forecast is a big part of that. And even in those states in which even in those states that actually maybe formally review or formally approve of an integrated resource plan, they may not necessarily have to approve the load forecast, right? It may be as part of the consideration for the generation that may get approved to be built out of it, or the transmission that gets approved out of it. But there's not a stamp of approval for that load forecast. And then I do want to say most of my comments are, I think almost, ahead of this, I was giving some thought. I was like, in what situation do state utility commissions engage in sort of operational forecasts on a day-to-day basis, like a day forward real-time forecasts? I can't come up with an example at the retail level. I can tell you that, when it's a hot day like it was last week, I suspect a number of regulators in the PJM region have the PJM app open and looking at what the load forecast is on the day ahead and real-time basis. But at the retail level, the operational forecast, I've not experienced or seen sort of the operational forecast come into it as much as I have the overall demand forecast on a going forward basis. But the last one is an actual review and approval of the utilities load forecast. And so there are some states, Ohio is a good example. I'll get into state specifics later. Ohio is a good example where there is a statutory regime in Ohio that requires formal submission by gas and electric utilities of their 10-year forecasts on a year-by-year, and I even think maybe a month-by-month basis in front of the PUCO, the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, for their review and basically sign off and approval of that load forecast that's going to be used to identify, at least in Ohio, transmission facilities. So they identify what facilities they plan to build, but also the load forecast that underpins it. The commission there is able to have a hearing. There's some specific statutory language about what the commission can and can't look at as it relates to that load forecast. But there are only a few states where the state commission actually goes in and says, your load forecast is good, your load forecast is bad, the assumptions you made were good or bad. Usually it happens in the context of a very specific proposal by the utility, right? And I think that's important because there are often instances where there's this, I would call it moral hazard, but it's probably not the best word for it. But I'll just use that for a second. That you often have instances where utilities show up and propose something: a transmission line, a distribution system upgrade, a new generator, and parties to the case, and maybe the commission themselves, agree there is a need, but have questions around, is this proposal the best solution to meet that need? It is a very hard ask of regulators to say, yes, we think there's a need, especially in the context of resource adequacy, energy adequacy, whatever. Say, yes, we do think that there's a risk the lights go off, but please go back and take a couple more years to come back with the better answer. Right? There's a real conundrum there for regulators of saying, we all agree there's a need, but this isn't 100% the best solution. And so load forecasts, having some insight into them with some significant time horizon, whatever that might be, a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, but actually looking at what the utilities anticipate and having appreciation for how they're planning to meet that in advance rather than in a responsive posture to a very specific proposal. In some of these states actually gives regulators sort of more tools to ahead of time put the utilities on notice that, hey, maybe you guys are overstating this, or you guys are understating this risk, so that the utilities are better prepared to actually come in with something that's durable, and they're not running the risk of being told no by the utility regulator, or the utility regulator runs the risk of having to say yes to something that's a subpar proposal. And so it brings me to one of the first states that I want to well, I guess I've already mentioned Ohio, but I'll mention another state real quick, Virginia. So Virginia reviews integrated resource plans. Most everybody at FERC knows Virginia has integrated resource plans because we've all lived through Commissioner and then Chairman Mark Christie talk about them, who has been a great proselytizer for how Virginia has long had a robust review of utility integrated resource plans. And for years, Dominion over forecasts, for instance, their expected load growth. And it would result in every year they'd file their IRP, it would this porcupine graph where, oh yeah, we missed it high. Oh yeah, we missed it high. And every year, well now it's kind of going the other way, but we'll ignore recent history and just talk about a little semi-recent history, that there was a constant miss. And as part of the integrated resource planning review process, the Virginia Corporation Commission actually, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically said, Dominion, go back and try again. This load forecast doesn't work. And so having the state have an opportunity, having the commission have an opportunity to have insight, transparency, and an appreciation for what the utilities are expecting, and then be able to course correct in a way that gives you some heads up and some awareness in advance, rather than having to say no or running the risk that utilities build stuff that ultimately aren't needed, either hurting their balance sheet or ending up hurting consumers by reflecting cost on their rates, can help state regulators and ensure that retail rates remain just and reasonable, but also make sure that retail load forecasts that ultimately get rolled up into wholesale load forecasts remain reasonable. And so I'll talk later in my comments, but I want to provide that as an introductory item, that these are sort of the prime ways that retail regulators run into it. And with my later comments, I'll talk about how those roll up into sort of the wholesale, your all's day job.
Good afternoon. Mudita Suri from Amazon. So I guess the much talked about large load. So that's the perspective I'll try and bring into the conversation today on what information do we actually have, how do we share it, how we're willing to partner. I would like to mention Amazon has a unique opportunity here on being on both sides of the coin, in a sense, as the data centers and the large load, computational load, whatever phrase is being used. We are on the demand side of the equation, but also as one of the largest cloud service provider, we also hold some of the technology and software solutions that can become a part of how to address it, how to become more efficient. So throughout our conversation today, I'll try to switch between those two hats as our dialogue evolves. I want to start, before I go into any further details, what is large load, right? So we use large load, we say data centers, we use computational load. It is a reflection of society's need. Like since 2019, internet use has increased 2.5x. We think the sudden increase in large load is all because of AI, but 80% of the companies still rely on on-premise infrastructure to support their data needs. And independent studies have shown that Amazon Cloud Services is almost 4 times more efficient in terms of power use than if all of us were to house our individual needs on-premise. So that is the large load. The large load is advanced healthcare and banking infrastructure. Large load is entertainment industry that we all access. Large load is the futuristic AI and machine learning technology. So that is the large load. It's not sort of a mythical creature sitting into the background, but it is responding to the society's need and the industries and the economic business progress within the society. Within that, I want to share what we currently do at a very high level. So a lot of my colleagues and fellow panelists here mentioned different kinds of processes that play out at state, at federal level. So Amazon currently shares in very early stages nameplate capacity and timeline that is used in system impact reports, and we work in partnership with our utilities. As things mature, Amazon then shares load ramps and detailed load ramps that get added into the integrated resource plan that Kent talked about, with financial commitments and financially backed energy supply agreements where Amazon commits to paying collaterals and paying a capacity charge and required commitments for any new infrastructure that is being built to serve the Amazon load. And then we also share as needed load profiles and load profile details to support not just the load forecast and planning perspective, but also grid reliability and grid stability analysis in the ongoing conversation. However, in our experience, there is a greater need of transparency. So just as an example of one of the ISO RTOs within the East, where we work with 3 different utilities. One of our utility partners submits our load as is. Other utility partner asks at the early stage a dollar amount and a collateral to prove our seriousness in the queue, which we love. And then there's another utility partner that does a whole lot of diligence on the forecast that is gathered and massages it and creates, I'm not sure, but so the point here being the lack of transparency in terms of us wanting to be a part of the conversation, but sort of lacking of what eventually gets submitted. How is our information being processed on our behalf? So that's definitely, I think someone mentioned, need for more transparent process, standard process, and Amazon echoes the need for that. Internally, Amazon has teams and processes and approval gates and whatever fun corporate lingo we can think of to ensure that at the right instant we are sharing the right data with our utility partner, whether it's nameplate capacity, load ramps, load profiles, or operational performance data. And we continue to share this data even after energy supply agreements or these contracts are signed in a lot of places, because a large load, a large forecast doesn't go from like 0 to full nameplate right away. So we continue to sharing these for the first few years to support the ongoing planning processes and planning studies for our utilities. So in conclusion, I would say maybe 5 things in terms of what's Amazon's perspective into this conversation. Standardized forecasting methodology and transparency. So Amazon supports establishment of consistent standardized process, definition, so we all speak the same language across different ISOs, across different RTOs, so that the financially backed commitments is reflected in system planning. Guardrails to curb speculative load. So imagine who dislikes speculative load more than you. We do, because we're not one of those. So we support the ask for larger financial commitments, put the onus on the load rather than assuming on our behalf of what our load could be, enabling growth while keeping costs down. So that's something Amazon has talked about in this forum and a lot of similar forums where independent research has shown, and I'll go into some of the details as our conversation progresses, that structured large load integration backed by defined mechanisms for proper financial commitments has led to.
I'm going to interrupt. I do want to hear some of the processes for large load, and I'm concerned that you're making some recommendations and advocacy for certain processes and approaches that may impinge on some of the current proceedings. So if I just ask you to kind of walk through some of the things Amazon does,
Yep.
rather than talk about some of the things that Amazon thinks should be done.
Okay, no, thank you. Maybe I'll talk about a partnership and collaboration. So Amazon is available with the utilities we work for within the ISO and RTO footprints we work in. Use us as a partner. Ask us questions. Ask us what additional information could be helpful for the problems that are at stage. And lastly, I want to talk about the other hat that I had mentioned, which is the software solution. So Amazon and Amazon Web Services have been anchoring innovation solution. We have Amazon SageMaker that's helping utilities develop load forecasts that takes into account historical trends, future anticipation, weather patterns. We also now have a tool that can take, and I've worked for 2 of the ISOs, and remember the day you kickstart a study, leave your laptop open, hope nobody shuts it overnight, and you come back to a contingency analysis being complete. So now we have cloud-based tools that can sort of condense all of that within hours of creating a model, solving the model, having those contingency, and from the earlier conversation today, even model some of the gets and dynamic line rating options to help indicate and support faster solutioning of those mechanisms. So yeah, looking forward to the rest of the conversation, and again, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. I think everybody has established that load forecasting is a genuinely rich field of inquiry. I think I have about 45 follow-up questions based on what we've heard so far. I would like to get into some of the questions about the sources, quality, and types of data that are necessary, as well as the analysis to get more useful load forecasts given the current state of the grid. But first, maybe start with hopefully an easy question. I heard a theme from, I think, just about everybody that we all share an interest in accurate load forecasts. I think there were a couple of perspectives that might vary slightly on whether there is potentially, or the nature of the harms of over-forecasting or under-forecasting. And I would like to drill into that, Fisher, slightly by asking about the time horizon. Is there greater or lesser harm to over or under-forecast in a long-term forecast versus a near-term forecast? And I'm thinking both from an economic and a reliability perspective. Does anybody have a thought on that?
I'll go ahead and start. So I think you bring up a great question, Chris, which was around this forecast accuracy. And so the way we would think about this is, these forecasts can be 100% accurate, and we can still have challenges on the grid, right? And so the load forecast accuracy isn't a direct reliability factor, but it affects the reliability processes needed to run the grid. So from an accuracy perspective, that's probably not the goal in long term, right? It's really about making sure your assumptions are sound, your inputs are sound, and they come from credible sources. They're a lot of these assumptions around the things that the panelists have talked about, around having financial backing and approval from states and kind of the processes to confirm those. But really, it's in kind of this long-term engineering studies, you're not going to be accurate. In fact, you're probably more likely to win the lottery than hit your forecast in the 10-year period, literally. But the beauty is that this is done every year, right? So you have a lot of uncertainty in the 5 to 10 year period, but as you get into the second year, the third year, the 5 to 10 period becomes the 3 to 7 period, soon becomes the 1 to 6 year period. And so on that rolling basis, those forecasts get refined. And what's really beneficial is that when these forecasts are out of sync, and even when they get into the shorter term window, the operators have a lot of different tools at their disposal to manage concerns, whether it's operational procedures, instituting new IROLs, interconnection reliability limits, whether that's emergency appeals. There's a range of tools the operators has at disposal when the load forecast isn't accurate.
Thank you. That was helpful. And I think following up on a suggestion from Kent Chandler, we can go back the other direction this time, starting with John Wilson.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is that we heard in our survey with the ESIG work, we heard both perspectives from utilities. We heard some that were very focused on being very careful not to over forecast. That was their prerogative. Others were very focused on not missing any opportunity to support the needs of prospective customers. And those are both legitimate values. And then when we would follow up with them, they would both acknowledge the other perspective and say that was important too. So it's a matter of balance really between those two, and we certainly heard different perspectives. In our report, we sort of put out 4 archetypes of how different utilities are constructing load forecasts. One was very much to focus on just contracts. They would only consider contracted demand, so you would need to meet a certain legal threshold as to whether your load was ready to be served. Different criteria might be used by different utilities, but you think of it as sort of a contract threshold. Do you have one or not? And if you do, you're in the forecast. If you don't, you're not in the forecast. End of story. The second class, which I would think is the most common one, is more of a weighting and threshold approach. So you have a threshold in which a customer is even considered for inclusion in the forecast, and then different weights depending on whether certain milestones or certain criteria are met. There may or may not be an extended forecast attached to that includes load that's not associated with specific customers, but that's uncommon. The third method, which was much less common, is that extended forecast method. And that would be a statistical approach that would basically say, here's what we've been seeing from large loads, and we're going to extrapolate that in some way out into the future. And then the final method, which is really compatible with all the previous 3, is stochastic methods. And those are where a number of different variables, different weighting thresholds, or different weights or thresholds are used in constructing scenarios or stochastic futures that are then used in planning. So most of the utilities are using the first 3, which are deterministic and sort of come up with a single large load forecast, and the remainder are doing that stochastic approach. The other thing I would comment is that I think this balance is struck depending on the market considerations, the market design. So for example, Dominion and Duke, which are right next door to each other in Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, have very different practices. And it's because Dominion, Virginia operates in one market and Duke Energy operates in a completely different market context. So they have different priorities for what they're using their forecast for, which then determines very different practices that result from it. So I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing such divergence in it, which can make it confusing for a lot of people who are sort of looking at it and trying to say, what is the best load forecasting method? Well, you wouldn't want to copy Dominion's method into a region where, they're not dealing with a large RTO because it just wouldn't be practical. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And we might come back to the stochastic, deterministic, probabilistic methodology discussion later. But so thanks for raising that. But that's not where we're going now.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think as the consumer advocates and working with them, it is certainly the easy way to look at this and to sit there and look at the accuracy and how accurate it is and how accurate it should be as we go further out. I think one thing that struck the advocates was very easy. You look at the forecasting and it's always over forecasting, or was for a significant time. That raised red flag. So that goes into accuracy in part and what do you expect with the accuracy. The one thing I think is kind of a fascinating comparison for me over the years has been PJM in the operating committee, which will happen in a couple of days. They do a metric of the day ahead forecasting, and their goal is to be within 3%. And they do analysis, and they'll have a chart every month and say, here's that chart of every day and how we were forecasting. Were we within that 3% threshold? And if we weren't within the 3% threshold, they will go through a detailed analysis of, listen, there were a lot of clouds that day on the western part of the region, or this storm came in, or something happened, and there was some really good explanation and an appreciation for that metric, and it meant that there'd be further deep dive into why that happened. And that's kind of what I think from an advocate perspective we're looking for on any of these. So figure out what the level is and give us an understanding of what we should be expecting going forward. And I think for the PJM region, it's supposed to be a 3-year forward market. It hasn't been a 3-year forward market since the 2018 base residual auction for the 2021 delivery years, which is almost 10 years. But the 3-year forward is pretty important forecasting. And I remember, I don't have it with me, but I remember plugging into AI some of the numbers and looking at it and saying, hey, how accurate is PJM for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years? 1 year, they're pretty good. 3 years is not as good. And then 5 and more, is not very accurate at all. And so that's kind of, it's more about getting a metric and understanding on how we can improve this than really trying to be exactly on.
Thank you. Mr. Oates.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll just add to try to respond directly to the question that I think the implications of forecast misses in one way or the other depend on kind of the time frame and the magnitude of the potential forecast error that you get tied to the time frame, and then the specific decision that's being made at that time frame, the cost of that decision, but then also the kind of recourse that you have between when that decision is made and some ultimate sort of operational time period, say, and the cost of that recourse. And so to use kind of an operational example, if you're talking about a day ahead forecast, which could have a fair bit of error in it on a sort of operating scale, the decision you're making is really committing resources, which has, at least as a system operator, the decision you're making is committing resources, which has some direct cost. But there's quite a bit of maneuvering that you can do between day ahead and the real time if the forecast ends up being wrong. Some of those decisions, kind of in either direction, you can commit a little bit more, you can decommit some resources. They're not super expensive. If they're huge forecasts, it can be more expensive. Or huge errors, it can be more expensive, but not that expensive. And then there's sort of this concept of holding reserves in place that are hopefully linked to the magnitude of forecast error that you might have to manage, which can be in itself expensive as well. So there's sort of a series of recourse actions that you can take between when the forecast is made and an initial decision is made, and once you get to realization that all kinds of affects the costs. And I'll say that's an operational example, but I think there are some similar things to think through for generation investment or even transmission investment.
Got it. Yeah, thank you very much. Ms. Wright, you have a card up?
Thank you. To add on from the large load perspective or the consequence of under forecasting and over forecasting. So speaking first of under forecasting, the large load by nature is not curtailable. The kind of services and the industries that we support, but Amazon is willing to be a partner and explore, of course, when there are grid emergency events, just like any other good bulk electric system, grid citizen, we respond through the appropriate set of protocols in terms of what needs to be done as it's communicated to support a grid emergency event. But outside of that, the nature of the load is not curtailable. So the consequence of under forecasting, of course, is we find ourselves between the load resource shortfall, but we then also find ourselves in a situation of what is the expectation for a large load to respond in these shortfall events? What does it mean in the longer term horizon for, as I mentioned, all the services and the growing load, which is representative of the changing societal needs? What does it mean to serve that appropriately? And at the end of the day, we're, of course, in conversation here about wires and electrons, but at the end of the large load or the data center is compute that is being used by all of us and a lot of organization. There was an interesting recent study in Pacific Northwest that I think said 9 gigawatt of shortfall between load and resource by the time we're at 2034. Club that with the balancing authority in the area, which operates 75% of the grid, I think recently reported greater than 60 gigawatt of load backlog. And so how fast are the requests being studied versus where the line is being drawn, what is verifiable load, which goes back to my comment of financially backed loads. And then the consequence of over forecasting is also real. Like, at what point are we creating infrastructure which could raise costs for all customers? And again, the larger point being, like, yes, the under forecasting severity, of course, like my colleagues talked very well about the over forecasting, but even the consequence of under forecasting is severe with the shortfalls in the services that the large loads and other increasing loads are set up to meet.
Thank you. Any follow-up, colleagues?
So this next question is meant to explore where forecasting approaches naturally diverge and whether there are opportunities to learn from one another. And I think, John, you sort of touched on two regions where they diverge, but I was wondering if you all could provide more color onto some of the key similarities and differences in how regions approach load forecasting, both long-term and in operations. Are there any characteristics such as transmission topology, existing load characteristics that necessitate variations, and how can neighboring regions better coordinate? Go ahead, Ken.
So I'm going to have a non-electric answer just for a second, because I do I play a little matador to the question. I answer it directly, but I do think if we're talking about not having to reinvent the wheel in every particular region on every particular issue, I do think that there are opportunities to look at how gas utilities, and particularly pipelines under the Commission's jurisdiction, deal with long-term capacity load forecasts, especially when making the decision of whether or not they're going to build or not. And many of them use market-based processes like open seasons to identify demand and have that demand identify what price they're willing to pay and then commit them to long-term contracts. That's something that's not necessarily done on the electric side, but again, if we're looking at trying to recreate in some of these electric regions what works well in other places, I do think that looking to the gas infrastructure might be a reasonable place to start with. And so if you're saying, look, it's one thing to like make people commit to a bunch of money up front, billions of dollars of money up front, and say, whether you come or not, you're going to pay this amount. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense out of either economic efficiency purposes or just a good allocation of our limited amount of capital in our economy to just say, take or pay. There are opportunities in the gas system. If somebody shows up and says, yeah, I signed that 40-year contract at a specific rate, but hey, I don't need it anymore. Well, they have a property right that they can then sell to someone else. And even if it's at a loss, someone else may be able to use that capacity, for instance. And so, these ideas of just saying, we're going to charge you out the nose, and if you're not serious, then you won't come. I think there are other ways that it's being done in other places that are not necessarily yet adopted in the electric industry, but that make a lot of sense. That I even think Grid Strategies has done a report on applying things like network open seasons to electric infrastructure. So again, not directly responsive to your question, but I think that it's something that can or should be considered by some of these regional planning entities.
I'll go ahead. So yeah, I think there's definitely a variety of different approaches different areas are using, and I think what's important about that is, load forecasting is by definition and by process just a very unique set of processes tailored to every area. Every area is going to have very unique makeups, including their residential versus commercial versus industrial loads, the amount of data centers that are in queue or have already come in, giving those areas some historical knowledge. There's geographic differences where load forecasting might be very different depending on the type, where you are in a geography, of course seasonality, but also kind of how much resources are out there. That might come into play when you're trying to understand your load forecast. And again, I think it's all important to understand that these load forecasts ultimately go into reliability models, both the energy adequacy models, but also the transmission studies. And there's always risk built into those. And so, for energy adequacy, for example, 1 day in 10, that is a policy around the level of reliability needed in every area. That's typically at the state level. Markets administer it as well. IRPs do that in non-market areas. But that resource adequacy criteria is going to be very different for every area, depending on the types of loads that are there. 1 day in 10, I think, not to kind of deviate the conversation from load forecasting differences, but this is how load forecasts are used to understand your 1 day in 10 reliability criteria. That is basically criteria that was developed, back in the 60s around how much in need we are of electric reliability. And so do y'all, I know y'all are supposed to ask the questions, but do you remember what we were using electricity for in the 70s? It was the NERC motto, keep the lights on, right? We're not really keeping lights on as much as we are keeping computers and industrial processes up and running. So our necessity to have a reliable system has increased. And so I think states and other jurisdictions will use different processes to get to those to the place where they need to have to define what they need to have for a reliable system. The other thing I wanted to highlight when it comes to different areas, load forecasting processes is the point on coincidence, which I think is important. Y'all know for our Congress asked NERC to perform the interregional transfer capability study. A lot of that was looking at extreme weather, high loads in the system, the transmission system's ability to share resources across interfaces. And what we come to find when you kind of do a study like that is areas peak at different times. Sometimes they peak at the same time, creating even more challenges within that area, especially if one area is maybe relying on tie benefits with their neighbors, but there's no tie benefits when they're both peaking at the same time. So while different processes in load forecasting are tailored, at some level, some consistency, especially as John indicated in definitions, so they can talk to each other, is going to be really important, and ultimately to stitch those forecasts together to understand that wider area, which again is a big departure from what we've been doing for decades, as areas are more reliant on their neighbors during these extreme conditions, really than they ever have been before.
Thanks. Just as a quick aside, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and electricity is to keep the baseboard heater on. Mr. Oates.
Yeah, so it's as a developer of forecasts of various kinds, you're sort of naturally most focused on your own process. So it's sort of an interesting question for us. I will say, and others can correct me if I'm wrong here, that there's a bit of bit of a alignment, particularly or on the operational timescale. As those short-term forecasts have matured, I think there's been more consolidation around best practices. So you see a lot of weather-driven forecasts that are time series, kind of econometric models that have sort of similar level of geographic granularity. And differences that remain between regions do have something to do with fundamentals. So we, for example, have some parts of our footprint that are particularly transmission constrained, and we need to develop forecasts specifically for those load pockets, which is a little bit heterogeneous with how we do it for the rest of the footprint. So sort of that kind of thing. And then as we were discussing, the long-term forecast, maybe there previously was some alignment around methodologies, but as we've sort of entered this era of large load growth, everyone's trying to figure it out and sort of trying new stuff out. I agree with some of the discussion we've been having about how to guide that towards better alignment through consolidation around terminology, and like, what are we really talking about here? But I think there also is value in having different people try out different approaches to see what kind of sticks. And in terms of the coordination piece, we do a fair bit of this with our neighboring RTOs on an operational timescale, so particularly leading into tight system events like we had last week. Our operations teams are on calls with SPP and PJM, sort of checking what people are forecasting to get a sense of what the risk is and get a better sense of what imports look like. And we've also done some of that on a long-term basis to try and understand how folks are grappling with large load growth.
Thank you. Oh, and go ahead, John.
Thanks. So I'll add one other reason that there's a lot of divergence across the utilities. I think we've talked about a lot of them, but one of them is simply access to information. Some utilities have got a long track record of working with some of these large loads, and others are very new to it. When my colleague Sophie Meyer and I were reaching out to utilities and regions to ask them to present to our task force and explain the how they were doing large load forecasting, one of the first things they would say to us is, we can't share a lot of detailed information because it's proprietary to our customers. And then one of the other things they would often say to us is, do you have some information from some other utilities and load forecasters that we can use? Everybody was looking for information. Everybody wanted more information to develop better practices. And yet everyone was constrained or reluctant to share that information. It was kind of an interesting catch-22. And that's one of the reasons that some of our recommendations that we developed in our report were around institutional work on research and common practices. Again, alignment of practices, not standardized national practices, but practices that use similar information and use similar language to meet the specific market and policy needs of a utility or a region or whoever needs to develop the load forecast.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick a couple things that just heavy emphasis on having the similarities. I think John just mentioned and we mentioned before about common language. I think that would be certainly helpful as just even the PJM region focused on that. I can tell that there's some parameters that could need some standardization, even on the high level of historical peaks. Like the historical peak for PJM, if you look at their documents, the historical peak was set in 2006 at 165 gigawatts, and there's some debate about whether it may be hit for the last couple of days. But if you talk to the market monitor, even in our region, he would say, no. The historical peak for PJM is, I think, 155 gigawatts and hit last year. And it's because the market monitor says, what's the PJM region? Well, and PJM, or what's PJM, and PJM is talking about parts of the region that weren't included in PJM at the time, because First Energy, for example, came after that they incorporate. So there's not even a good understanding of the common language of what our historical peak is. I think the other one that comes into debate as I look at this information and try and look at weather forecasts or load forecasts, as we've been talking so much with the data centers recently, is weather normalized, and looking back at data, and you can't tell it stops at a certain point where there's weather normalized or not, so you can only go back so far with the information. So it's hard to, the tables change, the descriptions change. You can't tell what they're including with the old PJM or the new PJM. Even on those simple terms, some common understanding would help in some way to analyze what the peaks were and stuff like that and the information. So I do emphasize that. Also, the other one I would also support is the transparency. What kind of information should be transparent? I think there's a lengthy discussion on that with even the industrials in our region about like what kind of information can be transparent, and for us as consumers, trying to ask questions, trying to understand what's going on, and not being able to get even some simple data as if this load is at a data center. Sometimes it's very difficult to get. So it's trying to get some kind of common denominator on what kind of transparency we could have would be great too.
Yeah, thank you. I see Mudita and then John, but first, just to level set, out of curiosity, I'm hearing several pleas for consistency and perhaps ability to coordinate data, or load forecasts from one region to another. Is there a sense that is getting better, or is that getting worse, or is that a constant or a stable need for improvement? Like what's the state of play on consistency? And then I'll come back to Mudita and John.
I'll just jump in. On consistency, what I would say is we've gotten really good at consistency up until about 2023, right? And then the data centers are coming in. And now, when we used to bring in large loads, we've been bringing in large loads for decades. I'll ask another, have you ever seen an arc furnace? I haven't, but I've modeled them. They're either on or off, right? And so that's very different than the large. So there's so much more data that's going to get to the quality. And as kind of every area's, there's no best practices to follow and there's no roadmap for this. They have developed their own tweaks along the way. It very much reminds me of demand response. For years, we've always had demand response for decades. And, it was up until a point where demand response started getting very sophisticated, maybe uncertain because of what was providing that demand response, some uncertainty. And so NASB at one point had created measurement and verification standards that help define certain aspects and standardize those. So that could be something very similar. Again, I think all the assumptions need to be tailored. So you're not going to find consistency, I think, in specific assumptions, but I think you can find commonality in those approaches, and then ultimately some of those defined terms or metrics that come out of those.
Going back, Chris, to your original question, the regional differences from a large load perspective, Amazon does see meaningful differences in how different regions approach load forecasting. If I quickly summarize into three buckets where these differences show up. First is data details. What kind of information is asked of us, in what format, at what time, in what level of granularity. Some utilities request for site level, some utilities request more bulk nameplate. Second is commitments behind the data, milestones, and the process in place for at what point it's considered, yes, you're real and you're moving forward in the process. What does that commitment and milestone look like, financial or otherwise? And third, I would say, is transparency, where it varies hugely how we hear back on what eventually gets submitted to the regional planning entity, and what's being modeled as a base case, what's being modeled as a scenario case. So as a large load entity operating across multiple regions, that does make it challenging to understand how our data is being used, where a haircut is being applied, where it's not, and what eventually is being planned for. The other thing I would add is Amazon is not a grid operator, but increasingly is being asked to bring our own generation, bring our own power in different areas. So hence also this differences within the regions, within the definitions, within the utilities, within the same planning region also makes it challenging to understand what is being asked when we're asked to bring our own generation. And actually a good story there to share from Pacific Northwest is we operate our second largest global cloud cluster, aka data center cluster in Pacific Northwest in Eastern Oregon. That's also where we self-supply. So that's to say Amazon sort of maintains and owns the pipeline of electrons. And we work very closely with the utility. We've been operating there since 2012. And we work very closely with the utility in maintaining the load forecast. What is the load profile, sort of a high case, medium case, low case, and then work on our end on building that pipeline of generation and partner with the utility, sort of handing that portfolio to them that helps them serve us reliably.
Thank you. And actually, I have a very quick follow-up on the topic of the requests for data that your firm is getting from different grid operators. Specifically with respect to data that might be related to operational profiles, is there any consistency in the requests to your firm that you're willing to share? Because that's one thing that came up earlier in the conversation. I'm curious if there's vast diversity or if everybody's asking for similar information about, I don't know, reactive power, voltage level, oscillations.
I will say, that's a great question, Chris. And the answer to that varies at what point you ask us. Like right now, I know NERC has the NERC level 3 alert that is issued. So there's a different degree of data request or requirement. But otherwise, I would say it does vary vastly, and not just in the data that's being asked for, but also the format or the process within which the data is being asked for.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Thanks. And then I saw Ken Chandler has a card up.
Yeah, I just want to be responsive to your question about consistency, I guess, across the board. So I've never modeled an arc furnace, but I have seen one. I guess combined, we're a whole person. I remember touring. I won't say the name of the facility in Kentucky, but we have a couple of arc furnace facilities in Kentucky, and I remember the very large customer. They use something like 2 billion kilowatt hours a year of electricity. It said, when they started up the arc furnace for the first weeks, months, I don't know, maybe even year, they were coordinating almost every single startup with the utility because the utility didn't have experience with this type of facility, and there was a lot of growing pains in doing that. I can't imagine a situation where every utility in America was attempting to attract an arc furnace, and then every single one of them was seeking to, with hands-on initial experience, try to go through weeks, months, years of that whole call us every single time before you turn it on and turn it off. Because we literally, and they were saying that like they could feel the power plant down the street shaking when they were turning on their arc furnace the first couple of times. And that's exactly effectively what we have as it relates to data centers in this country, is that every single utility wants to attract many of them, and almost none of these utilities have any experience with them. And it's for better or for worse. I don't see a lot of, and I know there are endeavors. I know EPRI has some that are going on of trying to do data sharing, but I don't know that we can afford to try to have everybody wait until someone shows up that's a data center for them to get the same sort of experiential, the sort of same hands-on experience. It reminds me of a tour I did once with EPRI of I won't say the utility, of a utilities facility, and they had their own EV charging stations out back, and they were doing a pilot test. This is like 3 years ago. They were doing a pilot, and there were people smarter than me saying, well, what the heck are you studying here in your pilot? And they were saying it, and the academic said, well, I did analysis and research on this in white papers and tons of publication 10 years ago. Why are you, well, we needed the experience hands-on here in our service territory. We can't afford to have a recreate the wheel across every single service territory to redo how we're doing load forecasting. And without the ability or willingness of utilities or entities with the experience and the hands-on expertise to be able to share that readily and confidently, I'm afraid that we're just going to be like really inefficient and cost ourselves a lot more time and money than necessary. A great example of utilities working well together in this front is in Texas. They're building out a lot of 765. Somehow it's the only thing in Texas that's not competitive is transmission. But the utilities with experience with 765 facilities in Texas are like readily sharing information with other utilities that don't have the same hands-on experience because they don't operate those types of facilities in other places. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to find ways for utilities that have experience, Dominion, for instance, in Virginia. I've talked to folks engaged at PJM and say, of the load forecasts that happen at PJM, Dominion does it better than everyone else. Yeah, of course they would, because 2003 wasn't the first time, or 2023 wasn't the first time they started trying to model for load forecast purposes data centers. So if there's an opportunity for greater engagement, even on in what form or in what way, I think that's going to be imperative. Otherwise, we're going to be doing pilots for how to forecast data center operational impacts for the next 10 years.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks. So I agree with a lot of what we're saying here in terms of the benefits of further alignment. I do want to offer one somewhat contrasting view that sort of comes down to whether you think about load forecasting as kind of an analytical process that's modeling something almost like a physical system that you can get right or get wrong, which there's aspects to it that are very much like that, particularly in the short term. There's also an aspect of this, particularly on kind of a resource planning horizon, where you're really looking at the willingness of different entities to make investments at different levels of confidence. And this is something that we thought about a little bit in the context of our long-term load forecast, where we were trying to get from our members information about their large loads and the confidence associated with those loads on a kind of 20-year basis. And we said, well, we want to kind of break this down in terms of like high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence, right? Easy concept, but then you get into it and it's like, well, hold on, what's high confidence? How are you going to assess that? And we said something about, well, do you have an energy service agreement? Have you made a financial contract, sort of a financial commitment? Has that load showed up somewhere in MISO's process? And it took a lot of sort of back and forth to come up with some criteria. And we got somewhere. I don't think it was perfect, and it was also not somewhere that was completely aligned with how those members thought about their own confidence in their projects. So there's this aspect of it that's really about decision making, and so I would just have a note of caution around getting too far down the rabbit hole of alignment, so as to interfere with how different states, different entities want to decide how much risk to take and who should bear that risk.
Thanks. That's great. And I don't normally like to say in advance that there's a last word, but I think Mr. Wilson, after you talk, then I'll give that promise to break.
Great, thanks. Yeah, just a quick follow-up. So going back to your question about consistency, one of the things that we saw in our report was that there is improvement going on, but at the same time, all of the load forecasts are dealing with more complexity in the questions that they're being asked. And so I'm not sure which one is winning the race, improvement versus it becoming a harder problem. Certainly, as NERC has really dug into this, I think they've identified more and more things that need to be known about particularly compute centers, as opposed to a lot of the other types of large loads. And that is really challenging, I think, for load forecasts. With respect to the comments that Mr. Chandler made a minute ago on EPRI, they were partners in our project and helped us with a lot of understanding about what's going on within the industry. At the same time, I'll give you kind of a silly example. One of the things we wanted to include in our report was just simply a graph comparing an AI data center's 8760 load with a, say, an enterprise data center 8760 load. We could not obtain those simple data from any party on any basis whatsoever to create that graphic just as an illustrative exhibit in our report. And that's very similar to the challenge, I think, that utilities across the country are facing. EPRI is working to try to create some kind of an internal database that shares among its members, the folks who have sort of bought into its process. But that's as far as it goes, as best I can tell. And I think that's a real challenge for the industry, and one that hopefully it can respond to, and I'm not sure the best mechanism for that.
That's great. Thank you very much. As promised, I've got 3:27. I'm going to round up to 3:30 and give just over a 15-minute break for panelists to hydrate and stretch legs, and then we will reconvene at 3:45.
Thank you. Pretty good. Well done.
Yeah. Good stuff.
We're going to get back together in just a minute. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back from our break. We are going to continue the discussion of load forecasting. I believe we have a question from Paige.
Yeah, so this question gets into the load forecasting process. How does accounting for large loads change current long-term load forecasting methodologies? How do your forecasts address uncertain large load additions? What form would such changes take, such as changes to process, data collection, or coordination of software? Any takers? DL?
All right, thanks. So I can speak a little bit to some of the work we've done recently on the long-term load forecast, which is a process that we developed a couple of years ago, kind of directly in response to the emergence of new drivers of load growth, data centers, but also changes in manufacturing and other things. And so this is a process that is mostly used in our construct. It's not used for resource adequacy at all or to feed into our capacity auction. It's only used to support long-range transmission planning. So it has to be pretty long-term, 20 years out, as well as scenario-based. So we have to be able to do a credible job of capturing the range of load growth that we might see over a 20-year period, which is a pretty wide range. So a couple of things that we've done there is to, and this is not unique to us, but to focus on a combination of statistical approaches and engineering models to capture the fact that the type of growth that we're going to see in the future looks a lot different to what has been seen in the past. Break down end uses into some categories, so data centers, electric vehicles, a couple categories of industrial as well as residential. And then pull together a number of data sources to try and make that all work together as effectively as possible. We've touched on today some of the challenges around getting good, high-quality data of the right types to support forecasts of this kind, and that's definitely something we've experienced and tried to work through. And I'll say the general strategy here is to kind of go broad in terms of data sources, recognizing that each individual source will have flaws of various kinds. So we, this year, administered a new type of survey for our members to respond to on a voluntary basis, which we called our long-term load forecast pilot survey. So typically what we've done with load forecast surveys from our members is we've asked for pretty simple stuff, right? We've asked for quiescent peak load, maybe broken down by month at the level of a member or an LSE. With this forecast, we asked for specific loads, specific large loads. We asked for their size. We asked for their ramp-up period. We asked for information about their chronological load profile. And we also asked about confidence. So I mentioned this earlier. We had some challenges around getting that exactly right. And we did, some similar stuff around electric vehicles and DERs. So we got about an 80% response rate there. It was not complete response, and we were able to do some cross-checking with some of our other more long-standing forecast processes to make sure that at least on their own merits they were well aligned. So that was helpful to inform the range. So you can imagine the sort of low and mid end of that range uses only the high confidence large loads, but then in the upper end you're using more of the lower confidence stuff. So I think I'll kind of leave it there, but the approach was really to try and leverage multiple data sources, have a scenario-based outlook, and break down different categories of load growth and model them each using their distinct characteristics.
Just a clarifying question, how are you measuring confidence?
Yeah, so this was something that we asked our members to tell us about, right? So and we did this specifically for the large loads. We had 3 different categories: high, medium, and low confidence. And what we said about the high confidence category was there had to be some kind of objective criteria tying that sort of with a plan behind that load. So maybe somebody had signed an ESA to serve that load. Maybe the load had made some kind of a financial commitment. Maybe that load had been submitted as into a transmission planning process that MISO administers. So those were some of the criteria. There's obviously still some variability within that category, but that was sort of the objective one. Medium and low confidence we kind of left it to more to our members to determine the difference there. What we ended up finding is that I think on a 2030 basis, of the sort of 80% response rate we got, there was something like 20 gigawatts of high confidence. But then the top, when you accounted for the high, medium, and low confidence, was something like 65 or 70 gigawatts. So it was a much higher end range. And so when we actually turned that into our forecasts, we didn't use a lot of that low confidence stuff, but a little of it in the high end forecast.
Greg?
Yeah, thanks. It's an evolving question, evolving answers. For one, even last year, I would say, as I was talking about data centers and coming to PJM, depending on what time of the year, I would use 2030 as the base year. You're talking at points you're talking about 60 gigawatts coming in by 2030, which is the size of the California ISO, and then at times it was 30 gigawatts, time of New England ISO, all coming to the PJM region in the next 5 years at that time when I was talking about it. So, and it varied up and down. So it was really how to account for this and how to determine what was the actual amount was a big deal in the PJM region. And I really do have to recognize PJM and the processes they put in place, particularly with these critical issue fast paths going forward now, and in other discussions to really get the discussions, get the people involved in the room, including the states at all levels, from state legislators to governors, state consumer advocates, state commissions, state consumers and themselves, getting in the room and saying, here's the things we need, here's the things we expect, and will help tremendously. You had the data centers, the Data Center Coalition, and specific data centers coming in saying, here's the information, because they want it to be accurate too. So it really was trying to figure out and get everybody in the room to come up with saying these are the specific things, and getting more specific into what the data centers would bring. So that's a significant evolution of the PJM process, at least as I would know it from the consumer side, of PJM using outside sources to figure out what the trends are on electrification, what the historical numbers are, and figure out what kind of new loads we have industrial-wise, which weren't that big a deal over the last decade or two. But all of a sudden we have this massive load. So now we're looking specifically and PJM's being pushed to get more specific with the information they get. And Manual 19B attachment, Manual 19 Attachment B does a really good job and is evolving as time goes through to talk about like the construction commitments, the electric service obligations, and financial responsibility, including minimum demand provisions, length of term, exit fees. All those things are being more specific and more expectations on the data centers to kind of try and help to figure out some of the accounting for what the large loads will be to the best extent possible. So it certainly is evolving, but it's going in the right direction. I think that the one thing, as I said before, is the transparency of how can we do verifying it you need some level of verification that we should be able to do on this, and it's kind of hard with the transparency levels to figure out where that fits in.
John Wilson.
Thanks. So the first thing I'd say is that accounting for large loads doesn't really change conventional load forecasting methods very much at all. Those are still ongoing. The econometric forecasts of small residential, commercial, and even sort of medium to large industrial loads. Those methods, for the most part across utilities and regions, remain intact. And what's being done is that they're adding on top of that a new forecasting practice for very large loads. So hope that distinction helps out a little bit. The one exception to that I'm aware of is in PJM, where the PJM large load adjustments, they then go back and consider whether there's overlap in that forecast with the existing econometric load forecast. And they may say, we're not going to add all of the load from, say, AEP into the load forecast because some of that is already accounted for in our econometric forecast. That's the only example I'm aware of where there's sort of interaction between those two load forecasts. For the most part, it's just simply A plus B, if that makes sense. I think the one thing I would say is that in terms of sort of addressing uncertainty, as you asked about, and how to do that, there was a really great recommendation that was in the draft reliability guideline from NERC that I think was pulled out of the final document. Hopefully it will reappear in another document. It was kind of right on the edge of the scope, but it was for simply saying that we needed some kind of a maturity assessment practice in the industry. And again, I don't think it needs to be applied in exactly the same way for each utility in each region, but the same concepts need to be applied. And so, we've heard conversation in the draft. They talked about data sharing agreements, interconnection agreements, financial security posted, proof of site control, construction status, and so on as being factors that you would consider in a maturity assessment. And a really good example of a maturity assessment that is widely used across the electric industry, there's no regulation that requires it, is the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering's cost estimate classification system. So you may be familiar with this where projects that are very early in the process are class 5 projects. They have very high uncertainty about whether the cost is accurate or not. And then you progress through engineering and design and cost procurement to class 1, where you have a very high degree of confidence that your costs are going to be accurate. Still not certainty, but a high degree of assessment. And we think an analogous process could be set up. That's in the ESIG report to suggest that that's a good model for load forecasting, that projects or even just types of load that a utility may expect to come onto its system could be identified depending on the timing and the type of load and those milestones that I just mentioned, whether they're class 5 loads or class 1 loads. And I think something like that would give then a common language so that you could compare one load forecast to another to see if what kind of metrics they feel are relevant to determining whether a load is high confidence or low confidence, but using sort of similar terminology. And you find that, of course, utilities, when they're doing cost estimating, have different practices, but they're using a common language around that, and they're using a common way of then going back and verifying whether that cost estimate process was accurate or not. And that's really the key thing here, is that we don't learn from improved load forecasting unless we have a verification or validation, not verification, but validation process, where you go back a year or two later and you come back and say, how well did we do that forecast? Which metrics that were inputs were right on, and which ones that were inputs were not so well on? If you don't define those inputs clearly, then you can't go back and validate them and make sure that they were appropriately constructed. And so that idea of sort of develop the inputs clearly, put them through a transparent and consistent maturity assessment, and then go back and do validation on that method and improve it is kind of the approach that we're recommending in our report.
Okay, first Mudita, then Kent.
I want to start by first echoing something John just said, which is very important. Accounting for large load shouldn't fundamentally change the load forecast methodology or the conceptual philosophy. I think that makes sense. I think the distinction here is, as a large load as Amazon, that I would like to call on is the speculative versus the non-speculative large load, and that's the uncertainty. And I heard DL here say sort of MISO working through a high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence, and the question that Paige asked is a question I want to ask every planning region within which Amazon is either operating or planning for a data center. Where could we see this clear, transparent definition of high, medium, and low confidence that then gives me the bar that I need to meet and demonstrate, whether it's in form of I heard land permits, energy supply agreement, PG collaterals, financial commitments. Where is that line between high, medium, low, and that clarity is critical. So I just wanted to make that point. Like accounting for large load, does that change forecasting? I hope not. If large load sort of follows the same fundamental of a clear, well-defined, transparent definition of what makes it in the study and why in the base case, in a high case, in a low case, which is critical. And as a large load, we would welcome that distinction and that clarity so we can demonstrate which bracket our load sits in.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything that well, I'm going to disagree a little bit. I don't know if it's a fundamental change in the way you do load forecast, but I do think there are now going to be additional considerations. So I think about this in the context of a sort of a how, when, and where demand takes service are all important considerations when you're doing load forecasting, right? The temporal and locational considerations of the system and load and generation have always been, well, in modern history, whatever that is, have always been taken into consideration for these things, where demand is, where generation is, and then when and where it's either producing or taking service. I do think that in a future in where there may be differentiated load service or increasingly differentiated load service, I think that's an additional complexity that's going to have to be taken into account when you're doing load forecasting. So, I mean, I think about it, the distinction between like NRES and network service and energy only service for generation. If you have, I'm really doing my best job here not to discuss open cases. Insofar as a utility might consider offering differentiated load service, where you say, where you might say like an interruptible or a semi-interruptible service, you necessarily aren't going to then, if that customer is going to be paying for semi-interruptible or interruptible service, it would not make much sense when you're doing the load forecast to assume that customer is taking, true service and that can't be interrupted. And I don't think that's something that's particularly novel because, I mean, we have, PURPA was passed in 1978. I mean, we've had cogen and SPP and behind the meter small power production facilities for industrial customers across the country, and I'm sure utilities have lots of experience of modeling them differently than if those customers didn't have that same type of behind the meter generation. But I think it's an additional complexity that insofar as there is differentiated retail service or transmission service for load, that it might have to be taken into account differently when doing load forecasting.
Well, I won't have to talk too much. Ken, I think, brought up my point. So just 2 quick points. I think confidence, like Paige was saying, probably much more important than accuracy. Having confidence, having a maturity model that shows how mature your interconnection processes are and all the factors that you consider gives you more confidence. So I think that's really good because we've kind of seen it played out where forecasts are high, they look high, but we're still not building the capacity to support that, all right? And so the numbers are there, but low quality and confidence, right? So better confidence in the data, better confidence in the forecast, meaning better signal, better outcomes. The other piece I think is really important is that demand response and that flexibility piece. I think about it separately. Flexibility, meaning more, maybe responding to price signals, working with operators, doing their own customer side demand shifting. I know, I have a little example of this when I was giving my ChatGPT prompt some really difficult engineering studies to perform for me, and it said to me, "This is really complex, but I can have this to you by 9 o'clock." So and I was doing it during the day, right, 3 o'clock. So right there, OpenAI or whoever is trying to figure out how to shift loads on their own. So all that flexibility, I think, can ultimately get to the load forecast. But then the other piece is demand response. I think Kent hit the nail on the head there, which is we have to understand whether or not these loads are participating in some sort of program that can be responsive to system operators and emergency conditions, and that will greatly change the way those are incorporated into the load forecast.
Sorry for the follow. I just wanted to, I guess in some ways disagree that maybe PJM is different in other regions and places, but I know it is different in other places. But we certainly have a lot of data centers, a lot of 10, 20 gigawatts of data center load coming on very quickly, if not more, and it is different. And I think the market monitoring analytics for PJM has done an excellent job of kind of specifying and kind of detailing those differences, even to the point of that he called out in the last few auctions $23 billion for customers having to pay more because of the generation needed because of the data centers. And so the load forecasting it can't be something where it's just as it was before. It has to be something where you're looking at it differently and just the different way it's coming on the system and how it's really a tidal wave for our region. And I do think the thought of DR and where it goes is we're talking about this PJM stakeholder process that's currently going on. And if you do have a lot of data center load coming on and they decide to go demand response or some other mechanism, that will have significant impacts on the load forecast, depending on which route they choose of the available options, whether the board decides to submit that to the FERC, it will have significant consequences.
Because some of those stakeholder processes may involve current proceedings, I'm going to ask you to.
I thought I was going to future ones. Thank you. I will stop there. But there are certainly ramifications that can happen, depending on how it goes. But I think this data center load, the specificity that stakeholders and states and federal government trying to deal with it is super helpful in the load forecasting process. Sorry.
Now, I'd like to just confirm for my benefit what time horizon we are talking about here. It sounds to me like the discussion about confidence levels of load works a few years out, perhaps, but not for a long-term load forecast where, if my understanding is correct, previously we relied upon economic modeling, which may not account for drivers of the new large load additions. So is there something different that we would need to do, if my assumption is correct about the interesting discussion that just occurred? If my assumption is correct, is there something we need to do differently to think farther into the future, if that's even possible?
So I can offer how we thought about this, and I'm interested in others' responses. So when we thought about the sort of profile of large load growth over time, and to be clear, our long-term load forecast is 20-year forecast, so we have to provide a long-term view. We thought that there were, two bookends of ways we could get this very wrong. So one way would be to look at what is happening right now and the sort of dramatic buildup of load that we're all looking at and arguing about like exactly how big it is, but it's quite big. So one way would be to assume that persists forever, right, and just extrapolate out. The other way that we could, I think, get it wrong is assume that it totally stops at some point in the future. And so we were sort of looking at different approaches to handle that transition. And what we ended up doing was applying most of this, so this high, medium, low confidence that I mentioned, applying most of that in the near term, and you get a pretty wide range of outcomes in the next, say, 5 years. And then beyond that, kind of transitioning to a growth rate that reflects the broader economy. So kind of an economic growth rate starting from wherever you land 5 years from now, to avoid either of those bounding errors and still get a credible 20-year range.
Thanks.
Just, Mr. Oates, can I just follow up on that? The 20-year load forecast MISO conducts, what is it used for? And does that change how you approach it?
Yeah, very much. So the 20-year forecast, I'll say a couple ways that we do not use it. So we do not use it in our prompt year capacity auction. That load in that auction is determined by our members, not by MISO. We also don't do any resource planning in MISO. Our members do that. The long-term load forecast that we put together does not affect our members' resource planning. It also doesn't affect the short-term sort of reliability-focused transmission planning to interconnect load or generation. We use this in terms of like a concrete output. We use it to support the long-term LRTP, long-range transmission planning process for the regional backbone, which is a scenario-based process where we look at sort of a range of futures and decide which sort of set of transmission projects we want to build to address that. And then we also use it for informational purposes. We talk about it a lot with our members and our states, but the concrete use is for the long-term load forecast, or long-range transmission planning.
Thanks, that's useful context.
Well, thank you for that question, Eric, because that's kind of where I was going to go, which is, for that short-term horizon, those are for decisions that need to be made in that time frame. In that 10-year horizon, kind of what we're thinking, or even 20-year, those are for completely different things. Accuracy, less important on those, but direction and setting signals, really important. So 10-year period is where you're building transmission, right? And so the beautiful part about doing it on a confidence basis and understanding confidence is you get these kind of confidence levels. And you can kind of draw a line somewhere and say, even in my low confidence or even in my, rare events, I'm still going to need all of this infrastructure, right? Even right. So there's kind of the no regrets approach, and I think that comes out of the confidence values when you're doing those long range, and so you have some direction around where to go, not necessarily accurate to the point.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll echo Mr. Oates' comments about, in the archetypes I mentioned, that some of the utilities focus on sort of contract-only load, and so that forecast essentially stops after a few years because whatever you've got in contracts, is going to get built, and then you don't have any more load coming into your load forecast in terms of large loads. And then you have some utilities that are forecasting essentially growth that goes on forever. There's some statistical forecasts that are used by a few utilities that essentially take the past and extrapolate it. And so you do see that as well as a practice. So you see both of those perhaps errors in a sense or kind of extremes. But I want to point out a third issue, which is something that none of the utility load forecasts that we looked at have yet addressed, and that is attrition and systemic risk. We know that one of the reasons that computing data centers and AI in particular are building so fast is that it's a very competitive industry, and there's an understanding that whoever gets there first essentially will be one of the market leaders. That implies that some of these large companies that are building out a lot of data centers for AI and other similar uses are going to be not first, and that they may fail. And when you have that, you will have a significant number of facilities that will either be bought up by competitors or just simply shut down. And that systemic risk is not reflected in any load forecast that I'm aware of. Similarly, just general attrition. A company may sort of hone its business offerings. It may build out a number of data centers and then after 5 or 10 years focus in on one or another areas of work, and it may gradually reduce its portfolio. That's typical in every other industry. It's present in econometric load forecasts for small businesses, for large businesses, for multifamily housing, et cetera. That sort of understanding that you're going to have turnover and churn, businesses come and go. That's not present in the large load forecast that we saw. If a large load is put into the forecast, it's essentially in there forever. And that, I think, is an oversight that is systemic across the industry. It's a reflection of the fact that we haven't been doing this, but just for a few years. So I think I want to give a lot of grace there, but I want to point out that it's something that needs to be addressed in the next few years. It's a hard problem to solve because we don't have a good basis for forecasting how many businesses will or facilities will close down, how many will reduce their load in 5 or 10 or 15 years, et cetera.
And following on that, I think the other thing that I haven't seen, I'd be interested if John has, is consideration of price and the impact on demand of changes in prices or rates going forward. I mean, I think of, I received a CPCN application as a commissioner, 3 or 4 years ago, and the application for the combined cycle, there were a couple combined, for the 2 combined cycles each, increased, I'll just say, significantly between the time that the utility filed the application and the commission approved one of the CPCNs. That utility has subsequently sought CPCNs for additional combined cycles, largely to meet demand growth from expected data centers. The cost of those combined cycles have increased double-digit percentages since that CPCN was approved 3 or 4 years ago. And so you're expecting demand that's expressing their interest to you at one point in time, that if by the time they show up to take service, prices have increased on a going forward basis 50 or 60%, there is the possibility or the risk that they all of a sudden realize that it's too rich for their blood. And there is an outstanding question in many of these jurisdictions of like, who bears the risk of being wrong? And contractually you can mitigate some of that risk. But I do think that to your more pointed question, the longer time horizons, I'll just speak for myself. I mean, scenario-based planning gave me a lot more confidence in longer term horizons than I needed in shorter term time periods, because the risk of being wrong, as long as it was directionally right and consistent across varying or very different, even somewhat similar scenarios, gave you a lot of confidence in the ultimate outcome that it was a good idea to say yes to it. That's just less of a consideration when you're talking about a 3-year forward or a prompt auction, because getting it wrong, you bear the risk for a very short time period, and that's not the case when you're talking about billions of dollars of transmission or generation.
I wanted to add some perspective here, and again, I can't speak to all large load computational load out there, but at least from Amazon's perspective. So let's break this down into the 3 time frames that you asked about. I think on an operational level, as mentioned before, like in event of grid emergency, it's very clearly defined within NERC's umbrella, like what accounts for a grid event and a grid emergency event. Amazon acts as a responsible grid participant as anyone else within the defined processes. But outside of that, I mentioned before, the computational load is not by nature curtailment for what it supports, but Amazon's happy to support flexibility as needed as long as it's defined within like processes and tariffs. In the medium term scenario that we are talking about here, I think the discussion sort of goes back into the clear definition of like that high, medium, low. I do agree scenario-based planning makes more sense. It gives you a range for what you're looking at, and as the load in that scenario-based planning, it helps us to know what accounts and falls into which scenario. On the long term side, I will just say a few things to address some of the comments here. First of all, when Amazon gets into or opens a data center, just like utilities, Amazon also has customers at the end of it. There are contracts for compute power that have been committed and promised with the 5.9 reliability. Data centers are also long-term infrastructure. They don't, at least Amazon data centers are not planned for 3 years or 5 years. And in line with that, we have signed multi-year ESAs. So when we go out and procure power, whether it's paying then our fair share for the infrastructure, substation, grid upgrades, or our fair share for the electrons or net new resources needed to support, we are getting into long-term multi-year contracts, sort of showing that commitment to support a longer-term planning horizon. So all in all, like going back to one of my original points, like, again, not speaking for all large load, but Amazon's here and happy to partner. So if questions exist without, is this large load verifiable? How long is the tenure? What is the ramp? We currently share in a lot of regions, the utilities we operate with, we'll share monthly load ramps, quarterly load ramps if needed, hourly load profiles to support grid resiliency and stability analysis, and happy to continue doing that.
Thank you all. I wanted to back up slightly to the question that Eric asked regarding the longer term forecast and maybe pick at a thread from a different direction. I'm interested to learn about how load forecasts are integrated into the resource planning process. I think we know something about how that works in the RTO and ISO regions, but putting a finer point on it is interesting, maybe from the perspective of whether there are improvements to make sure that the load forecasts that are being conducted are useful in the way that the world and the energy has been evolving lately. And similarly, for those of you who have knowledge of how that process is conducted outside of the RTOs and ISOs, we're curious whether there are any ways in which utilities in non-RTO regions have it easier to take advantage of load forecastings and conduct planning.
Yeah, you weren't looking at me, but I feel like, yeah. So I like to joke that Kentucky, which where I still live, is the most interesting state for wholesale electricity outside of Texas. Kentucky rests is situated in both MISO and PJM, and the largest utilities in Kentucky are actually members of the non-RTO Southeast, or I say members, I guess they're really not members, but they're part of CERTEP. So members of CERTEP, non-RTO Southeast, and then the southern portion of Kentucky is served by the Tennessee Valley Authority, which I had effectively no engagement with because they like it that way. And when you ask why, they're like, "Oh, the Constitution." So it is very different. Now, I'll say even so, in a vertically integrated state, that's even so, which is like the majority of MISO, with the exception of effectively Illinois, with the exception of Illinois. It's vertically integrated states, but still in an RTO, still in a market. Many of those states they may have, like Indiana, for instance. Indiana changed their integrated resource planning process to align with the reality that they joined an RTO. So they started taking into account, they didn't ignore the fact they were in an RTO when they do integrated resource planning. The extent to which a state does it differently or doesn't do it differently for utilities that are inside or outside RTO varies, but like all of the utilities in Kentucky have effectively, when they're doing integrated resource plans, do integrated resource plans exactly the same, regardless of whether they're in an RTO or not. That's largely a function that all of them maintained being vertically integrated even after joining, so they continue to still have the same service obligation. With a single exception, all of them have sufficient generation to meet their retail demand. That one utility has sufficient generation in association with affiliates across like a fixed resource requirement plan in PJM. So like they're not short, they're not purchasing with the market. They are sufficient. That's a long way of saying that like when it comes to transmission planning, I think it is. I'll use your term. I think it is much easier when you're a vertically integrated utility outside of an RTO. I think for one, I think my initial sort of I don't know, half smart aleck reason is like I would say it's easier to gatekeep, right? There's just a lot less transparency. There's a lot less, obviously you don't see on a day-to-day basis congestion, for instance. You don't see, you don't have capacity prices that are varying. You don't have day-ahead prices that are, maybe different than real-time prices. There can just be like frictional gatekeeping that, insofar as expectations and reality are, don't line up. It's just not as obvious as it is in wholesale markets, given the transparency of pricing and the 500 stakeholder meetings that happen a year and everything else that goes on. So I do think it's easier. I'll say that like I don't know if it's a function of just the times we live in, but like for the two largest utilities in Kentucky, the last IRP that I did for those utilities, well, I guess less CPCN I did for those utilities. Sorry. For that same generation we were discussing earlier, those utilities expected demand to go down to be flat or declining over the next 15 years. That was the basis for their proposal in that same case to retire a significant amount of coal-fired generation. 2 years later, they were back at the Public Service Commission expecting, I think it was something like 60% of energy growth in like the next 10 or 15 years. Right, so things can change very quickly. I'm not saying that, well, I guess we'll all see who is right, who is wrong. But the reality is that when you're responsive to a single entity and you're effectively not having to engage with other folks in consultation, yeah, it is easier. I think you're a lot more nimble, that you can just come back as a single utility, file an update to your IRP, file a new CPCN, come in and cancel a CPCN. It's just It is easier. I don't know that it's necessarily better, and I don't think it's necessarily more economically efficient. But it is less transparent, and I think that the lack of transparency leads to that nimbleness and easier outcomes for the utility.
Thank you. John Moura and then D.L. Oates.
Yeah, great. And we don't do the planning, so I'll rely on our fellow panelists to talk about that. But I did want to kind of comment around kind of the differences between ISO RTO versus your kind of more traditional vertically integrated utility areas. Really around the timing, right? So in most market areas, you've got kind of some forward commitments, sometimes only 1 year, sometimes 3 years. In the IRP, right, the I stands for integrated, and that integration is really an integration of both costs, the planning on the electric system, but also planning on the gas system. And I think that's something that kind of goes into that resource adequacy question. So there's a lot of benefits, and I think they've been described, Ken described them really well, around that kind of command and control function, being able to look out and commit to a plan 10 years in advance that has the state's authority behind it. Very important. A lot less uncertainty in that case. When you're looking at the market areas, a lot more uncertainty in those forward years, which also leads to some distortion, I would say, in the fuel choice that are available, technology choice. With 3-year forward commitment, you almost take nuclear out of the question. Maybe it is out. I don't know. I think there could be a lot of future for that, and only really in the regulated state utilities you kind of start seeing some of that maybe start to emerge, or other fuel choices as well. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, so I can kind of offer a little bit on the opposite side of that coin, at least from the MISO perspective. So you asked, is it easier for a resource planner to do their resource planning outside of an RTO? And the opposite lens is, well, what can RTOs do to enable the benefits that they have, right, in terms of transparency, but also in terms of being able to transact across a broad region while avoiding introducing unnecessary disruptions to the planning processes that are going on to allow construction of long lead resources. And I won't go do too much MISO horn tooting here, but there is a reason that we use our members' load forecasts in our capacity auction, right? Because if you've done all this work to build a resource plan and you think you're resource adequate, and then all of a sudden we say something different in terms of how much load you have, particularly if you have better visibility into that load than we do, then that's going to create, an unnecessary distortion. I'll also say that there's some kind of time and collaboration. I know it's kind of a throwaway word, but there's some time to ease in changes. We've gone through this with our slope demand curve, which took a long time coming because that's another one of these things that introduces a shift in the resource planning processes and our accreditation reforms because they take time for people to wrap their heads around and integrate them into their planning processes. But I think that's time well spent.
Thank you. Any follow-up? Is this me or you?
I guess shifting gears a little bit. So we wanted to ask, how do current load forecast methodologies, both in operations and long-term planning, obtain information about a new large load's operational profile, such as size, ramp rate, or information about any behind-the-meter generation serving the load? Are there any software tools that that you know of that can sort of bridge the gap here?
Maybe I'll start. We don't have a lot of experience with, and we don't do load forecasts ourselves. We use them, so I'm not wouldn't comment on maybe the software used. But again, as you get software, you're able to create some insights that maybe you hadn't created before. What I wanted to mention was the question around how do we get information about large loads operational profile, and that's all I think about engaging with the customers, right? Having that engagement, building the relationships with the customers. There's a number of data that we've outlined that's needed. John Wilson talked a little bit about them. Hourly profiles, seasonal shapes, ramp rates, diversity, flexibility, curtailability. Some what we heard are not curtailable. Whether or not they have backup generation, storage, other behind the meter resources, probability of realization, right? Kind of getting to that confidence level. So there's a number of that, but of new data that's going to be needed. But really, it's really about engaging the customer early and building those relationships so that you can get all that information in a easy way.
Ken?
Yeah, ESAs need to be more, I don't know, I guess ESAs need to be better. Like I think of a utility in Kentucky that also has affiliates in other states, and the ESA in Kentucky was a single page. This was, a couple years ago. I would hope to goodness they've asked for more information, but I mean, they would have multi-megawatt, dozen megawatt, 100 megawatt loads that would fill out their ESA, and it would be a literal single page that would be filed with the commission. They have affiliates in other states that have dozens of pages for their ESA. And one way I think that I think about this, I think Greg is right that PJM has done a lot better over the last 6 to 8 months on how they're doing their load forecasting and sort of what they're including and not including for purposes of the load forecast. And a lot of that is frankly putting them in a position to where I think they're having to call balls and strikes with some of their their primary members. I remember the first thing I learned about an RTO is you can't have a TO without RTOs, and so there's like inherent governance and independence friction that just occurs. But basically, putting PJM in a position where we're having to question the individual transmission owners' large load adjustments is kind of an uncomfortable position. But having them come up with objective rules saying we will not include large load adjustments if we don't have this following information, there's a way for the RTOs, for instance, to demand information being provided by the individual utilities for their large load adjustments in PJM, for instance, in a way that actually then forces that utility to do something differently at the retail level, to show up to the Public Utility Commission in that state and say, okay, we now are amending our form ESAs to have this type of information in it, because if we don't, we run the risk of missing out on economic development opportunities, because PJM won't include this in a load forecast. We won't be able to build the transmission to accommodate it, so and so and so. Or maybe even worse, like they won't build the transmission to accommodate the load through the regional processes, and then we're going to have to build the transmission to accommodate it through our local processes. And guess what? We'll get 100% of the cost allocation for that. So, anyways, there are things that like the RTOs can do on their own, that they control processes that can effectively dictate outcomes and changes at the retail level without having or running afoul of jurisdictional issues.
And I'm just going to caution everyone when we're talking about loads and large loads and the agreements they have to derive. Well, let's avoid talking about what the suggestions on those should be, because that runs into some of the current proceedings. We can talk generically about what is being done, but not what are some of the changes that are being considered.
Okay, next we'll go to Greg, then DL, and then John.
I already have my own. I hope Eric tell me if I'm crossing. Because the way I'm thinking about this is, I know you will, is I think the points I already made, I do agree that engagement is a big part of this, engagement with the customers. I also think that the expectations that are being put on large load are certainly helpful in the process, so everyone knows what the guidelines are. I think that there's also an expectation of having it be accurate and verifiable is something that's really been pushed by consumer interests. And I think overall, I think one of the last things that the consumers are expecting and have expected is some kind of accountability. Who owns this information? Who's responsible for this information, the load forecast? Is it the transmission owner? Is it the customer, the data center in the situation? Or is it the RTO in our situation? That kind of it should be taking accountability for making sure the information is accurate and is acceptable as possible.
So I'll just try to directly answer the question for a couple of MISO's processes. I've talked a lot about our long-term load forecast, and I think all those components that you mentioned show up in the survey process. So I won't belabor that again, even though there are opportunities for improvement there. In terms of our MISO transmission expansion planning process, which is the process we use to build transmission to interconnect load. We also get information there in terms of the kind of multi-year ramp-up rate, the size, and to some extent, BTMG, if you go way down in the weeds, there's some questions about certain types of BTMG that may or may not be included, and there's probably some opportunity for additional clarity there. The thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit was the sort of operating timeframe modeling processes, where, if I think about why the RTO is in a good position to construct operating timeframe load forecasts, it's because there is, a certain amount of averaging that's happening across the, within some regions. There's a lot of sort of statistical links to weather that we can administer. We have a lot of the sort of raw data, and then importantly, the relationship between kind of a zone And the zones that we focus on for our short-term load forecast, there's kind of like 100 of them or something in the MISO footprint. So they're fairly granular zones, but they're still not nodes, right? And that mapping between the LBA sort of zones and the nodes is relatively stable over time. A bunch of those things kind of break when you have large loads. So there isn't as much averaging out that you would expect. There's not as clear weather linkage, and the zonal mapping is all over the place, right? Because now you have these huge concentrations, and so there is, I think, some of the things that you asked about, Paige, some need for additional information there. I'll leave it there.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? So I noticed in your statement that MISO's members don't typically forecast behind the meter resources, and I was just wondering why, or is this something that you think is going to become more prevalent?
Yeah, and there, so just to sort of lay out how I think about the behind the meter question, there's a set of resources that we have visibility into that are represented in our network model, either because they're connected to a MISO transmission facility, or sometimes not. We just have information about even distribution connected resources, but maybe they're not in our markets, right? So we have that bifurcation, and some of those we sometimes call BTMG. There's also, in some cases, resources that are distribution connected and that we don't have visibility into in any model, right? So it's that second. So the first category, we tend to have pretty good forecasts and visibility. The second category, we have often less visibility into. In terms of how the BTM show up in different forecasts, it's kind of a mixed bag depending on what type of BTMG we're talking about and what forecast process. For example, when we're talking about our operating timeframe forecasts, we're getting those at an LSE level, so it's pretty not very granular geographically. And what we're really trying to get at there is the market load. And so that's going to be net of all of those BTMG kind of by design. So there's a few details like that depend pretty critically on how the process that is using the forecast works. So it's not necessarily a problem to have that missed, but there are a few areas where we should have more visibility than we do today.
Thanks. So, Ms. Bradford, in developing the ESIG report, we spoke to dozens of load forecasters, reviewed dozens of load forecasts. I can tell you that categorically there are three things that I did not see or hear from any load forecaster. The first is the use, and this is speaking to long-term load forecasts, not operational. The first is the use of specialized software. It's not occurring. People are relying primarily on Microsoft Excel, perhaps on some kind of stochastic modeling off-the-shelf software, that sort of thing. I don't view that as a problem. I'm just saying that it didn't come up that there's specialized software. Didn't hear anyone also express a concern that there was a need for that. In econometrics load forecasting, I'm aware that some utilities use sort of semi-specialized software for that. I think that's a matter of convenience as opposed to a market need. Many utilities do it in Microsoft Excel as well. So that's the first thing we didn't hear. Second thing we didn't hear is anything about a forecast of co-located generation at large load sites in any of the large load forecasts. This is through middle of 2025, I'd say. So in the past year, there may be some that have developed through that, beyond that point. But certainly utilities are engaged with customers who are planning co-located generation behind the meter or otherwise, and they are dealing with that in an operational context. But in terms of load forecast numbers that we were seeing, and graphs and even qualitative descriptions Didn't see that or hear about that anywhere. Third thing we didn't hear about is load flexibility. Again, in the context of large load forecasting, a lot of discussion about it in tariffs, a lot of discussion about it in interconnection processes, but not in the terms of load forecasts. I think that is coming, but I think what people are grappling with is, okay, we've got load flexibility, now how do we put it into a load forecast? And they were scratching their heads. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm just saying that it's a new topic and it's one that needs to be considered carefully. I think on the operational forecast side, that was outside the scope of our work. I do have the opportunity to participate in NERC's large load work group, and I think there's a lot of work going on in that space that does involve software. A lot of modeling, a lot of new modeling challenges that have not been really faced before by the industry. And, this is my first chance to really engage with NERC. More as a spectator than as a giver, but certainly I've had my opportunity to help out a little bit there. But my sense is that for NERC, this process is moving at very high speed. There's a lot of urgency, a lot of sense of we've got to get this right, but we've got to get it right fast.
Thanks, John. I agree with your observations there. Certainly moving at lightning speed. I wanted to mention something I didn't mention before around the accountability and kind of our adaptability as an industry. Utility planners and operators, they're incredibly innovative and adaptable. I always kind of refer to, MacGyver must have had his internship at a utility where he kind of learned all those skills. And so the important part of that is, the folks at the utility, they'll find the data, represent the data, figure out ways to fill in gaps when's needed. And that's worked for decades. Utilities used to send out, surveys with, a dollar bill in it. Just say, hey, how does your electricity use? Or, they used to go to, Walmart and say, how many electric heaters did you sell? Just to kind of figure out how can I get information about the load? Because loads have never been really accountable for anything except for getting the power. And I think that's been okay because loads, no single load has really impacted the grid to the risk that we potentially see in the future when you have massively large loads that are, can be potentially swinging the system. So the point of all that is that may be changing, and we don't have ex parte rules, but we talk very publicly about the direction we're heading and the things that we're thinking about to ensure accountability, to ensure industry planners and operators are able to obtain the necessary information, model, forecast, whatever's needed to ensure they can build and plan and operate a reliable system. So in that vein, NERC has thought, and we are continuing to think, and we're working with the large load working group who is working at lightning speed, very similar to the way we operated with inverter-based resources and kind of all those protections and models that were needed. We're kind of working that with large load. The large loads have been wonderful, I would say, to work with, very involved, not observing, participating, been very helpful on that. But I think at some point, there might be, and this is industry working to create standards and standardized ways of doing things, opportunities to put certain standards on very large loads that can have impacts to the reliability of the bulk power system. And some of those requirements might be to share data, to share models, to share information about their load.
Yeah, just a quick thought on sort of following up on Mr. Wilson's observations there about co-located generation and load flexibility, and I certainly agree that those are important to account for. There is some question in my mind of whether the right place to account for them is in the load forecast. This is something we've been sort of grappling with as an industry for a long time, right? Sort of famously decided to put a lot of demand flexibility on the supply side so that it could get compensated. So there's a sort of similar question here. And really concretely, when it comes to a granular model, like if you're going to have a quite large co-located generator that might be at a very slightly different electrical location than the load, you want that represented in your model at its appropriate location. And then you better have a gross load forecast for the load that's going to go right beside it. So you want to be thinking through these things. Certainly, we have work to do there, but representing them sometimes on the load forecast on a gross basis might still be the right thing to do.
Thank you. If you got something really quick, we're going to start moving towards wrap up. But go ahead.
Just wanted to add quick 2 points. Like, happy to hear from NERC about large loads. I don't know which large load he's talking about. I'll assume it's us. And the second quick thing, I think I echo the point that DL just made. As I've mentioned, Amazon shares all kinds of granular data from ramp to hourly profiles as needed. And I heard a lot of the fellow panelists mention engagement with members, and I think if there is this the narrative around sort of large loads being different from the loads we've seen in the past, and there is also engagement with large loads themselves that should be a part of this process in asking and not assuming on the behalf of large load. And then would like to echo a point that was made here that I think from an Amazon perspective, yes, please let us know what models, what level of details is needed behind the meter, where it sits, for how long, if it's a bridge solution, if it's a long-term solution, please ask us for that information. And then would be very keen to know how that's being used in modeling, because these models historically have existed for more aggregated load studies rather than like a singular granular customer detailed information, and how we bridge that gap will help understand how we submit data.
Great. Thank you very much. Before we get to some final remarks, I just wanted to give everybody a chance to share whether there are any improvements to load forecasts or the way that load forecasts are presented that you would like to see, whether that's more probabilistic approaches, confidence bands, different ways of visualizing or providing visualizations of the data to make it understandable to users. We don't have a lot of time for this, but if you have any quick thoughts, I think it would be informative to hear, since we spent so much time talking about what's going on with load forecasting to date. Maybe there is a fun direction to go.
Just my one of I was going to say my biggest frustration, but it doesn't even make that list. One of my significant frustrations as a retail regulator were the number of, and understandably, I'm going to steal just some of John's comments. This is very understandable from the utility perspective, but it was still very, very frustrating from the regulator perspective, was the number of effectively off-the-shelf or proprietary to someone else data sets or inputs that utilities use to come up with their forecasts for purposes of planning that were then the utility was then subsequently unable to share. And so for everyone that didn't sign an NDA or wasn't employed at the utility commission, it was effectively a black box as to how the aggregate load forecast or the aggregate plan comes about. And so I would say more transparent. I don't know, someone would do a great public service to be able to make transparent some of these inputs that are otherwise today proprietary and that are not obvious to anyone else whether they're any good. And if you don't make it public, then the few people, frankly, all of this should be public in all of these cases. I understand folks have worked really, really hard to make these things and they're of value, and so they want to sell. I'm a capitalist, I understand. But this idea that we're going to make up this econometric forecast and then sell it to utilities, and the utilities can't show anybody, but it's going to be the basis for billions and billions of dollars of capital expenses, really kind of rubs me the wrong way, given the incentives that exist. So open source opportunities, I think, are really something that should be addressed, and I think maybe the national labs are well placed to do that, and and other folks too. But it just makes sense.
John Wilson, real quick.
I'll take this question as what haven't we discussed? And I think that's geographic information. Certainly in the nearer term, 2-3 years out, we have a good sense of where the loads are going to be built. But when you get into load forecasts that are, say, for 2030 or 2032 or 2034, where you're starting to plan for transmission and maybe major generation builds, what we don't know is which of the loads that are prospectively coming, where are they going to be within a service territory? So if you have, say, 50 gigawatts of load in a region, and you know that, and you're forecasting that only 20 of them are actually going to get built, which 20? Because that matters for a transmission line, and that matters also for where you put the generation. And that is a real challenge that I don't think any utility load forecast has tackled or solved. And it's going to be a significant one for that sort of what used to be considered long-term load forecasting.
Yeah, the really quick sticky point I had, maybe something we hadn't described, talked about is, for normal demands that we've brought on for last decades, one of the biggest impact to them or factors of those is the weather, right? So depending on how hot or cold it is really drives the loads. And so as new loads come on, there are different factors that are going to drive those. We haven't really talked about crypto as another large load, but crypto market, that's kind of like the weather, right? Similar to as utilities have had to build weather forecasting departments, or maybe relied on weather forecasting contractors to really understand the weather, and not just the temperature, wind, drought, all these things, right? We're heavy into conditions. There might be other areas where utilities really need to understand what factors play into how much load might be on the system. We hear a lot that, the large loads, and maybe data centers are, expected to be at like 90% load factor. I don't know. That's very high. That means, cat memes all day. So what are the factors that are going to be driving maybe the seasonality or daily, and really understanding those? So then we can actually do, what we do with regular demand, right? We weather normalize it. We can kind of figure out how good the forecast was. What's the similar practice we would do with some of the large loads?
Yeah, and thank you very much for the question, because it certainly is something that comes up a lot. Number one, I would agree with what Kent said about the sources from an RTO perspective. The confidentiality behind the sources can be a struggle at times. And number two is, what is the expectation of the forecast? I think I've heard from PJM, it's a forecast, it will be wrong. That's not what the expectation should be. There should be some level of margin of error or something like that, and that would be something that would be very helpful to be pushed upon, at least the RTOs. Thanks.
So I just wanted to sort of tie together a couple of threads that we've talked about here that I think are interrelated. So we heard a little bit about this kind of new space that we're in, right? We're struggling to even name what it is that we're talking about. And there's some direct pain points around that. Like, what type of load are we looking at? Is it adjusted for DR? Is it gross? Is it adjusted based on a former RTO footprint, right? Just to sort of as the tip of the iceberg when we're getting into this sort of new space of long-term load forecasts. We also have this sort of, what I perceive to be a tension between the transparency and getting access to new types of data that we may need as an industry, but maybe don't quite know how to ask for specifically because of problem one, right? And so, Mr. Chandler was talking about the transparency challenge, and what we've faced is we have tried to articulate an ask to our members, and it's a little squishy, and they're kind of hesitant to share with us. And we have protections in our tariff for confidential information, which all of this is. So we need to get that information, but then we can't really share as much of it as we'd like. And there's a way to sort of square this circle if we can be very clear about what the information is and have a well-defined process to aggregate it and define sharing rights and that kind of thing. But because we're at this early stage in the process, not all those pieces are in place. So we're trying to innovate and we're trying to make progress. And I think we are just in this time where there are some bumps associated with that. And I'm not sure that we're quite ready to put a ton of structure on it today before we're done working through some of those issues. Maybe soon, but I'm not sure if we're there today.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to acknowledge Commissioner Lessert, who is a public servant of great stamina, who has been sitting with us today. Commissioner?
Can you hear me? Oh, there you go. I've tricked you because I showed up at the beginning and the end, so there you go. But I want to say thank you to everyone to talk about load forecasting here today. I know we had our House Oversight Committee hearing early in the spring, and we got a ton of questions, real in-depth questions from House members, and they broke out charts and they started talking more. So you can tell if the House is talking about some of these issues, then we all need to pay attention because a lot of people are bringing those questions to their desk. So it's paramount that we start working harder to get this right. We don't just take the utility data as it is. And to John's question, I think that we need to start talking about overbuild estimates where they don't exist now. You know, of course, one of these AI developers might become the Coca-Cola of AI one day, and then maybe you'll have a Pepsi, and then it's a far, far drop off to like the store brand AI versions after that. So what happens in that landscape, we don't really know. Some of those facilities might get swallowed up and purchased. Some of them might get repackaged into something else, but it's environments with a lot of volatility. So as you're asking those questions, as I always say to everyone in the building, then you better also bring me some solutions to those questions too. So we've got a lot of collective intelligence in this room as it relates to load forecasting. We've got a lot of forward thought, and I'm really thankful that we all have it here together so we can collaborate, so we can push these issues forward, and we can find solutions. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. That was a great final word, almost. I want to say this does conclude today's panel on load forecasting and day one of the 2026 software conference. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to all of the panelists that participated both on this panel and the earlier one on grid enhancing technologies. And in addition, I would like to say that staff does intend to prepare a notice inviting comments on the topics discussed today. So please watch for a notice to be issued in this docket. Again, that is AD 10-12-17 in the near future. And last, as Eric mentioned this morning, a record of this workshop will be available on the Commission's YouTube channel, and a transcript of the workshop will be available for purchase and eventually posted in the docket in the Commission's e-library. Unless there is something I'm missing, thank you all and have a very good evening.
Very fun. Greg, nice meeting you in person. Love your perspective.
Thank you.